podcast. I'm Jack Kelly, and I'm joined today by Rory Taylor.
Hello.
And I forgot your.
That happened last time as well.
I think it's to
Keep
give
that
first
in.
names.
No.
Keep it in.
Lovadinov.
Yeah.
Nadja
You've got it.
Lovadinov. Hello and welcome back to TLDR News Podcast. I'm Jack Kelly, and today I'm joined by Rory Taylor.
Hello.
And Nadja Lovadinov.
Hello.
Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay,
Very
great.
good.
That wasn't our second attempt.
Wrong.
How are we both doing today?
Cheers. Got an all-star cast.
Yeah.
Rory
The
Nadja
New
special.
combination.
New
Yeah.
combination. It's made, I don't know, all-star, I don't know.
We'll see how it
We'll
goes.
get there.
A new alignment,
Yeah.
certainly. A new constellation of stars.
Yeah.
We can agree on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
New axes of power.
Yeah.
Sorry?
No, nothing.
Okay, so as always, we're going to start today's episode with our underreported stories of the week. Then we're going to dive into our main story, which today is about the situation in Israel and the way that the international support is changing and different alliances and structures in place. And then, as always, we'll close the episode by going through our world leader leaderboard to establish who the true winners and losers of the week are. Let's start though with underreported stories, and let's start with yours, Rory.
Okay, so my underreported story, I think it came out last week, but after the podcast, is on the US reimposing sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry. This comes about 6 months after the US sort of relaxed sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry in a way to sort of encourage Venezuela to hold freer and fairer elections later this year. The Venezuelan government made a number of commitments that the US said, if you stick to these commitments, we'll free up your oil industry. The US now, 6 months later, is saying those commitments haven't been fulfilled, or at least some of them haven't. So they're reimposing sanctions. So it's a bit of a turnaround from the Biden administration. So some of the things that they are unhappy with that Maduro and Venezuela has done are preventing the sort of main popular opposition figure from actually standing against him, and then also blocking the person who was meant to replace her. So now they've ended up with sort of their third choice, effectively, as the opposition candidate. They've also arrested a number of sort of activists and staff members of the opposition. So obviously the US isn't happy with that. And I'm going to sound like Zach here, just fill his boots for a while he's not here. But a lot of this has to do with oil prices as well.
No way.
Because the initial relaxing of sanctions was obviously partly to encourage these elections to be freer and fairer, but also it was to sort of bolster the oil market, to increase the amount of oil being produced, to keep costs down, because obviously there's a US election, and petrol prices,
Sure.
as we would say, are a big factor in the sort of American public opinion about the economy. So Biden wants the strong global oil market. But now they've kind of U-turned on these sanctions. We'll see how that affects the market.
Okay.
But it also was partly because a lot of the migration into the US from the southern border is people from fleeing Venezuela. So the fear is that by reimposing sanctions, they'll sort of make the economic conditions worse, which will encourage greater migration, which is also a sort of hot political topic in the US and pretty damaging for Biden. So there's a lot of things being juggled there. And we had these 6 months where it looked like, maybe things are changing, but no, gone back to square one.
Shame.
Yeah.
Interesting at the intersection of all those stories, though.
Yeah.
Oil prices, border walls,
Yeah.
US election, Venezuela.
All
It'll be
comes
interesting
together.
how it all plays out over the next 6 months or so.
Yeah, definitely.
Good one to keep an eye on. Nadja, what's your underreported story of the day?
Yeah, so my underreported story is that basically over the past week, the UN have kind of gone ahead with putting a new resolution to vote regarding the Srebrenica genocide in Bosnia in 1995 during the Bosnian War, where around 8,000 Bosnians were murdered. And I'm kind of just bringing this up in the podcast because I think it'll tie nicely into our main story regarding the stance on like Israel and all these kind of cases that are being put in the international court or the UN regarding like genocide.
Yeah.
Because obviously you've got, Israel that's, been taken to the ICJ over genocidal claims in Gaza. Germany's also been accused by, I think, Nicaragua and one other country's also accused Germany. And then so now you've got this kind of new case. Well, it's not a new case, but the first time that this genocide that happened in Bosnia is being kind of revamped again into a new cycle. And it coincidentally, with everything else that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of just reframing like what is genocide, not what is genocide, but how everyone is kind of different kind of political actors are using it as some kind of bait to pursue their own agendas. So you've got, for instance, the nationalist leaders in the Balkans. You have Aleksandar Vučić in Serbia and Milorad Dodik, the president of the kind of Serbian entity in Bosnia, that they've massively backlashed against this new resolution.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of claim, it was a crime and it was a tragedy, but not a genocide. And then they've also got the support of, interestingly enough, so the UN Russian permanent representative to the UN, and then the Iranian ambassador to Serbia.
Mm-hmm.
So it's this kind of axis, this kind of Russia. Also, they've got some Chinese support as well. So you've got this Iran, Russia, China kind of support against this new case that's being put forward by, Germany, France, the UK, Bosnia, of course. And it's kind of sparking a lot of ethnic tensions in the Balkans again. And I think different political actors are kind of pursuing their own agendas and everything that's going on. And and it's quite underreported. So
Absolutely.
Forward.
It's interesting that I don't know if this is actually the case, but it feels like the international institutions are dealing with a lot more of these kind of disputes, particularly the ICJ, where you've got Nicaragua v Germany, the South Africa Israel one, like you said, and then also Mexico and Ecuador now at the ICJ, Armenia and Azerbaijan. It feels like there's a lot more of these sort of high level things going on. I don't know if that's actually the case or if they're just being noticed more.
Yeah.
It's quite an interesting time.
It definitely
if you're
feels
an
like that.
international
Yeah,
lawyer,
you're right.
I suppose.
No, you're right. I was going to mention that. So this case, so basically the whole point is that they want to make a July 11th, the National Commemoration Day of the genocide, and they're kind of modeling off the same kind of Rwandan resolution that was put in place in 2003, and so the Rwandan genocide happened 10 years before, and then now you've got this new resolution's coming up that's 30 years before. So it's kind of I think you're right, as in there's a lot going on.
Yeah. I guess they're learning from how other places sort of commemorated and dealt with these things. And
it's all coming out now,
Interesting.
A lot going on.
There is a lot. And it seems, as you say, to intersect nicely with everything else going on in the world, ties into the various disputes and axes of things that we've talked about in main videos and obviously the main conversation we're about to have. One other underreported story. It is raining nowhere in the UK right now.
Whoa.
That our map in the background of the studio I just spotted.
Huh?
It's not off. It's just raining nowhere. It's never happened before. Will it still be raining nowhere by the end of the episode? Stay tuned to find out.
I'm going to guess no. There's already some lights coming.
No, is that really?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh, literally live. I can see it changing.
Wow.
Oh,
Don't know if it will be picked
Norfolk.
up on there.
Anyway,
That was
Spoke
fun
too
for
soon.
a very short moment, at least.
keep an eye on it. Keep an eye on it. Okay, let's move on to the main story today, where we're going to be talking about the situation in Israel. The potential of Israel losing international support, and also just the status of the war. We're about 200 days into the conflict at this stage, and I think it's worth appraising both how the international community is responding and also how the war on the ground is going, whether the main objectives are being achieved, that kind of thing. Should we start by looking at the support for Israel internationally? Because obviously this is crucial. We've seen in other conflicts in Ukraine, across the world, that this international support is really vital, both from a military perspective and just from a authenticity, legitimacy perspective. The most interesting ally here, obviously, is the US. They're Israel's primary ally around the world. And there's been a lot of news recently about military aid, about the US's support, about divergent opinions in the US. Do you want to give us a rundown on what the US's position is right now and where they stand?
Yeah, so the main headlines of sort of come out recently are, one, the US just passed this massive foreign military aid bill that covers not just Israel, but also Ukraine and Taiwan. But it earmarks about, I think, $26 billion, which will go to Israel for military assistance, but also some of that will go for humanitarian assistance in Gaza. I don't know the exact breakdown, but it's sort of split across those two. So obviously you've still got this massive financial and military support for Israel coming from the US, but at the same time, there's news that the US is preparing to impose sanctions on on a battalion of the Israeli military called the Netzer Yehuda Battalion, and that's pretty unprecedented because it's under these laws that the US has, which effectively says we can't give military support to units or armed forces that are complicit in human rights violations, etc. They've used that law in lots of other places, but not on the Israeli military ever. So this would be a big first. But it sort of has to be taken with a pinch of salt because obviously it is significant in that it's a first. Israel isn't happy about it. Even the sort of rival political leaders in Israel, have come together and said the same thing effectively, that it's bad. But when you weigh that up against the massive package of military assistance for Israel, it sort of suggests that actually the overall stance isn't changing a huge amount in the US. Biden has obviously also said plenty of things about sort of warning Israel not to invade Rafah, warning Israel to better protect humanitarian workers and let in aid. There's lots of these sort of rhetorical things aimed to pressure Israel, but so far the overall support is still there at the sort of governmental level. In Congress it is split. You've got some Democrats who don't want to give unconditional aid to Israel, some Republicans who are sort of opposed to being too involved in any foreign conflicts. So it is split there, but generally at the governmental level, that support is still there.
Nadja, do you have anything you want to say on that? You don't have to.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what Rory said, I think that it was a massive majority of voting for the aid to go to Israel. There wasn't a lot of backlash. I think only Senator Bernie Sanders had said something that it should be conditional. Aid should be conditional.
He's one of 3 Democratic senators who voted against
which
it,
is such a small number. And then you also had, of course, the kind of Palestinian recognition vote at the UN. US again was one of the. Was it the only? I think it was the only country to veto it. So basically, what Rory said, they've unwavering in their stance of support for Israel.
Do you think Israel is concerned at all by this? This obviously is some movement. This is some loss of support in the US. But it seems, as you say, that in the notable ways that matter, the US is still broadly on their side. Do you think Israel is concerned and sees this as a threat to the long-term situation, both diplomatically and militarily?
I mean, when you look at what Israeli leaders say, they say things like, we'll go it alone. If the US ditches us, we'll go it alone. We'll keep doing what we need to do. But then I think there was one interesting sort of series of events that sort of maybe gives an insight into the actual position, and that was when Joe Biden said that the US would consider how the Israeli military is acting in Gaza when it comes to offering support to Israel effectively. So he was sort of hinting that at some point they might start conditioning assistance. And very soon after that, Israel opened up more aid crossings into Gaza. Aid started flowing a lot faster, which suggests that actually, when it comes to it, the Israeli government really does want to keep the US on side. But that was obviously a success, I suppose, in the sense that Biden convinced Israel to do that. But it also was a bit of a, because for a long time, the Israeli government had been saying, we're not restricting aid going into Gaza. But then after Biden said that, and then they started lifting these restrictions and aid started flowing a lot faster, it sort of demonstrated that there must have been restrictions before making that decision. I guess they are obviously concerned with keeping the US on side, but there's also the flip side of this. We talked about Gaza, but the things going on in the West Bank where the US is taking a lot more of a punitive stance towards Israel, sanctioning settlers and sanctioning sort of entities that are responsible for these settlements that are illegal under international law. The government is still just pushing ahead with building new settlements, seizing more land in a way that is opposed by basically every country, including the US, and they're sort of doing it without too much concern. So they obviously, there is a point at which they obviously aren't that concerned with how the US is responding to those events in the West Bank, rather than Gaza.
What about the rest of the international community? Obviously, the US are a major ally, but there are a number of other countries that are relevant in this conversation. How do you think that's shifting?
Yeah, I mean, a big story that came out today, and I think we covered briefly in today's daily briefing, or yesterday's, depending when the podcast gets released, is so UNRWA, so the United Nations, I don't know what it stands for completely.
It's a slightly awkward acronym, but it's effectively the Palestinian Refugee Agency under the UN. Yeah.
They were obviously accused in January of by Israel of essentially, being I think the term they used was hardened militants, and that they were, involved with the October 7th attacks and essentially being infiltrated by Hamas. And then those accusations happened at the end of January, and then we saw a lot of countries who were funding UNRWA stop their funding, US included. What's happened this week, I think in the past 2 days, is that a report was commissioned by the UN, an independent investigation to look into to investigate these allegations, see if there was any evidence behind the fact that UNRWA employees are Hamas. The report didn't find any evidence, and the only thing that was stated was some employees showed some kind of form of political affiliation or political bias or something, but there was no evidence of any kind of employee being part of Hamas. And then what happened this morning, so that was 2 days ago, and then this morning, Germany, which was one of the few countries that still suspended still suspended funding into UNRWA, have finally allowed funding to restart again. Germany, the UK and the US are, ever since the end of January, they haven't been funding UNRWA at all. But I think over the past few months, there have been a couple of other countries. I think most member states of the EU, and then I'm not sure completely, but most states of EU members, they kind of restarted funding. Yeah. So you've kind of got this, Germany considering, they're kind of similar in their stance to the US with their kind of support for Israel, and they've obviously restarted the funding. So we can kind of see this like international consensus, slightly changing, or maybe just kind of flicking back and forth between whatever comes up. Really, it's hard. I think it's quite hard to say.
Yeah, Rory, what's your read on this?
It does feel like, I mean, excluding the US for a moment, feels like the international community or the sort of Western countries that are allies of Israel does feel like they are losing patience. And the longer the war goes on, like you said, we're 200 days in now, the longer the war goes on and the sort of more devastating the humanitarian situation in Gaza gets, the less patience certain countries have. Yeah. And, if we think about where it goes from here, I think it's quite hard to say, because for a while, the Israeli government was saying, we absolutely will invade Rafah. It's going to happen. And they had a deadline, I think, of the start of Ramadan. Then that obviously never happened. So these kind of things will be the next like big moments in sort of forming or damaging the relationship that Israel has with its allies, seems to be pushed back and back a bit. So I think US aside, the international community is losing a bit of patience. And part of that is actually not just because of Gaza, but like I said, the West Bank with these new settlements. I think the EU as a whole imposed more sanctions on certain settlers in the West Bank, sort of alongside the US. So on that side of the conflict, there's definitely a lot more going on that I think doesn't get looked at. But I think it's a difficult situation for Israel now because they had a lot of goodwill from their allies right after October 7th, and understandably so. But we're at the point now where the realities of the situation in Gaza are sort of changing that.
And obviously one thing that did make those changes is the situation with Iran. We obviously covered this in a number of videos, in daily briefings, all over the place. Yeah. How do you think that shifted things? Obviously that has changed perspectives to some extent, but is that an ongoing shift, or is it just part of the back and forth that Nadja referenced?
Yeah. Obviously those, I don't know if it was days or weeks, to be honest. I can't really remember. But when we had the back and forth strikes or attempted strikes between Israel and Iran, that definitely took the attention away from Gaza and more, made the rest of the world think, how can we avoid escalation here between Israel and Iran? So that sort of lifted the weight off the international pressure off Israel for a short while. I think that now that the risk of escalation seems to have sort of been reduced, the attention is focusing back onto Gaza and the West Bank. So I guess that pressure is going to come back onto Israel. But yeah, I mean, even when the Iran thing was going on, you had countries like the UK, US, really quite desperately urging Israel not to respond in too escalatory a fashion. And that's exactly what happened. They sort of followed those requests. So I think that definitely shifted the conversation for a while, but it feels like sort of drifting back into what it was beforehand.
Yeah, and also the fact that the EU did, I think, they put sanctions on Iran as well
Yes,
after the whole thing. So I think that also adds to kind of alleviating the pressure of Israel a bit too.
Yeah, so it does seem that given events, things do go back and forth clearly. There isn't a consistent state of affairs. The US seems broadly on board still with some tension there, but kind of beyond this kind of international reaction to things, the situation on the ground, the situation in Israel and in Gaza, do you think that Israel is winning the war? And do you think the kind of terms of winning and losing are actually even helpful?
I'm going to plug a video I wrote maybe a few weeks ago that is on the Global channel, which people should watch. But yeah, I think the winning-losing thing is a difficult one because this isn't a war like Ukraine versus Russia, where there's very obvious territory and sort of front lines moving or not moving in some cases. It's hard to judge, but I think you've got to look at the two goals that Israel set itself after October the 7th, which was to destroy Hamas and then also to rescue the hostages, the 240 or so hostages. When it comes to destroying Hamas, Israel has put out, I don't know the exact number, but they say they've killed thousands of Hamas fighters. Some of the Hamas leadership has been killed. The sort of top dogs haven't. But the main thing here is the fact that Hamas is an entity, but it has an ideology. It has a sort of it's effectively just a form of the current armed Palestinian resistance against Israel. And defeating that ideology is a lot harder than defeating the entity itself. Yes. And this is, that's not it's not a very insightful point because people have been saying that since October the 7th. People point that out when they set this goal. And it's the dynamic that you've seen in wars for years and years where you've got a bigger power versus effectively a guerrilla movement. It's a lot harder than it might first seem to defeat that. So I think even now there was a US intelligence report recently that said that realistically Israel is going to be dealing with lingering Hamas attacks for a long time going forward. And I think there was a report that quoted Benny Gantz, who's in the Israeli war cabinet, as saying that yes, this could go on, our fight against Hamas could go on for months, years into the future, even if that fight isn't like what we're seeing in Gaza now, or even if it's slightly different, that Hamas is not going to stop being a threat to Israel for quite some time, based on what these reports say. So, that goal looks like it's not going to be ticked off. The other one, releasing the hostages. I think there's something like 130 hostages still left in Gaza of the 240 that were taken. The vast majority that have been rescued came via a ceasefire deal. Only a handful have been rescued through actual rescue operations. So the fact that the current ceasefire negotiations don't really seem to be making much progress suggests that getting those last people out is going to be difficult. And yet, there's the thing we haven't mentioned is this massive sort of political upheaval in Israel. The families and survivors of the Hamas attacks and the families of the hostages who are really opposed to the Israeli government's approach to getting those hostages back, saying you can't have a military solution to this, which has put a lot of pressure on the Netanyahu government. That goal also looks like it's sort of faltering at this stage as well.
Yeah, also on that last point on the whole kind of, a big part of their war in Gaza is to, get the release of all the hostages. And, just also what you said about, the families protesting about the fact that, you can't really go into, the whole of Gaza, completely demolish it and expect the hostages to be safely, even safely released. I think the most recent negotiations between Hamas and Israel was that Hamas essentially said to completely just stop the war, stop the fighting, and the hostages, they would release, the hostages and everything.
Sure.
But obviously that's not going to happen. So it's kind of coming to the point, like, who is Israel fighting against? Of course, or it's quite an obvious question, but even with like their whole kind of interaction with Iran, that was also that even that in itself is kind of pointless in a sense. They've got some kind, they've striken an embassy compound in Syria, and then there's some fire back and forth between the two. But Iran has clearly, really, plainly stated, and the international community has also urged Iran that they don't want a war. They don't want any kind of escalation.
Yeah.
Hezbollah didn't get involved during that kind of, fire back and forth, which was seen as a big thing. If they got involved, it would be even bigger war. So it's kind of, who is Israel even fighting against at this point? You've got most of Hamas that's been, obliterated, and a lot of senior political leaders, which, aren't in the ranks anymore. And it's just what Rory said. This is something that's not going to end anytime soon. There's going to be, the fighting may stop in 10 days, in 100 days, 10 months. But you will still have, Hamas, the ideologies of Hamas will still be lingering after all this kind of destruction and everything. So,
it's hard to see an end game, really.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess that's something we'd have to wait and see what happens. But it's pretty bleak.
Pretty bleak.
Yeah.
No one's coming out of this all that well.
No
one. International communities losing patience.
Yeah.
People are getting less happy.
Yeah.
The war on the ground is getting rougher. No one's being rescued.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so let's move on to the next segment, the World Leader Leaderboard. And in good news, still not raining anywhere. Keep an eye out, but I don't see any rain. What a dry country we live in. Isn't it great to be in the UK?
Love it.
Okay, the World Leader Leaderboard, as always, each of our contributors gets to put someone up on the leaderboard. The winner of the week, they move up one position on the board, and the loser of the week moves down one position on the board. So we're going to have two people going up, two people coming down. Let's start with winners of the week. Let's bring some optimism. Rory, who is your winner of the week?
My winner of the week is Volodymyr Zelensky.
Oh,
I think he's pretty low down. So
he's on the bottom of the
hopefully he
board.
can go up.
Let's move him up.
Yeah. This is basically because, as we mentioned earlier, the US Congress passed this massive foreign aid legislation, which included, I think, $61 billion worth of military assistance for Ukraine, which it had a very awkward passage through the House of Representatives. It sort of sailed through the Senate a lot easier. And because of that delay, Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine is that Russia is sort of on the front foot, Ukraine is on the back foot, and is in desperate need of new military assistance, basically. So this has finally got through the US Congress, which is good news for Zelensky.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, there's a lot we can say about whether this support will, go far enough, and whether, the US will keep supporting Ukraine going forward. But that's a conversation for another time.
For now,
take the win for Zelensky.
Good news.
Now.
He can move off the bottom of the board.
Exactly.
He's up one.
Yeah.
Nadja, who's your winner of the week?
My winner of the week is Spain's Pedro Sanchez. Right,
Whoa.
So he was actually my first moving up winner of the week 2 weeks ago when I was on the podcast, and I'm moving him up again.
Big Sanchez
Big fan, big Sanchez fan.
So it's on the board, too.
Well, is that too high? I don't know. Okay,
No, we've got all sorts of people up there. So.
we've got all sorts.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was So there was regional elections in the Basque Country in Spain on Sunday, and it saw a kind of pro-independence left-wing separatist party come on top. Well, not really on top, actually. They tied with this this other pro-independence party that's kind of been in power for the past 40 years, but they're more right-wing. And this is good news for Sanchez and his minority government because he relies a lot on separatist parties and he relies a lot on their support to maintain his own government, which is quite rocky at the moment. So, big win for him. They gained 6 more seats than they gained 6 more seats than they did in the last elections. And they've kind of said, once the elections were over, they stated that Sanchez has their unwavering support, that they will support his government's policies, even if he does decide not to ally with them in any kind of parliamentary coalition. He'll probably ally with the other party that's kind of been in power for 40 years. They said, no, it doesn't matter. We support you anyways. So I think that's
Pretty
quite
good.
a big win for him, yeah.
Pretty big win.
Yeah.
And we've got a video coming out on the TLDR EU channel soon about the Spanish economy.
Oh, yes. Big
Absolutely
win
rocketing.
again.
Another big win.
What
Wins
a guy.
across the board. He deserves to be at the top.
He
I
does.
think
He does.
Yeah, Sanchez is sort of lucky in the fact that it's sort of awkward having to keep the support of these separatist parties in the different regions of Spain, but because the alternative to him being prime minister is the Conservative Party in Spain, with the support of Vox, who are deeply, deeply anti-autonomy, anti-separatist.
Yeah.
That, even if Sanchez isn't perfect with them, he's a whole lot better for their cause than the others.
Yeah.
I suppose. So he's quite lucky in that sense.
And that gets him to the top of the board.
Yeah.
Exactly where he wants to be.
Lucky man.
Top of the world.
Top of the world. Rory, who is coming down this week? Who's your loser of the week?
Yeah, my loser of the week, talking of separatist parties, is Humza Yousaf.
Oh, okay.
SNP leader, Scottish First Minister. I actually sort of forgot he was on the board until I reviewed it before this episode. He is.
here.
I can't. Yeah.
There he is.
He's one of the sort of weird, over UK represented things we've got on the board. Along with,
You mean having the mayor of London?
World leader.
Yeah.
What?
Yes, so he's going down for a number of reasons. He's had a pretty difficult time since he took over from Nicola Sturgeon, but just recently, Peter Marrell, the former SNP chief executive and husband of Nicola Sturgeon, was rearrested and has now been charged with, I think, embezzlement relating to SNP finances, so obviously bad for him. He also faced internal party rebellion over justice reforms, and now the Scottish Green Party, who is sort of in a coalition with the SNP in the Scottish Parliament, members have forced a vote on abandoning that coalition, largely because the Scottish Government has scrapped its targets to reduce carbon emissions by 75% by 2030.
Okay.
They scrapped the target because they just couldn't meet it effectively. They missed 8 targets in a row, so it became impossible. Yeah, so now the Greens might leave that coalition. It's not been a good week or few weeks for Humza Yousaf.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Okay, Nadja, your loser of the week.
Loser of the week is France's Macron.
Let's just
I'm ready.
calma.
Oh, Zach is not going to like this.
He'll come back next week and put him
Well,
straight
Zach's
back
not
up.
here, so
Yeah.
basically, France economy not great, big debts, and there's speculation that some credit
You moved him up. He's meant to go down.
Oh, shit, sorry.
Don't. There's some kind of speculation that France is going to receive a credit downgrade. In December, they were set by the credit agency S&P as having, they set a negative outlook for the French economy. Things haven't gotten any better since. And now just looking more likely that they'll get an even shittier score. So Macron, you're going down.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. It's an interesting story because it kind of reflects a more general trend across these Northern European countries struggling, coming out of the energy and COVID crisis. This double hit.
This is what happens.
He's not the only one.
No.
I gotta give him credit, but he's going down for me.
This is what happens when he doesn't have Zach's support.
Yeah.
He pays off Zach to have his
He
back,
does.
and then Zach's at home with a baby or something, I don't know. And he actually gets let down. Macron falling off the board. So that's where the leaderboard sits today. As always, we'd love to hear who you'd move up, who you'd move down, and where you would have your own leaderboard sat. If you have suggestions of who should move next week, let us know in the comments. And if you have thoughts on the board as a whole, you can also let us know in the comments. It's interesting. The one from bottom rung of the board is becoming very busy.
Yeah.
As is the middle of the board. Really, the top of the board is empty.
To be fair, we have Schultz right at the bottom.
We do have
And
Schultz right at the
And I
bottom.
think that's justified.
Yeah.
I think
Wow.
Yeah.
All by himself.
yeah.
There's not many good headlines about him.
No.
Yeah.
I think we're quite
The people
accurate.
in the second bottom rung, they tend to just go between that and the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Good weeks and bad weeks, but they're not. gonna
Someone will
out.
break out of that rung.
Yeah.
One of the bottom lot will end up at the top. I know.
Trudeau. It's going to be Trudeau.
Trudeau.
I feel like he hasn't moved in about in months.
What was the last thing that happened in
I
Canada?
don't know. If you're
Is Canada still there? Canada? Are you still there?
yeah.
Not heard from you in a
Comment
while. Comment below if Canada is still there. We'll be back next week with another headline story from Canada. Some underreported story. Oh, it should be a Canada special. We should all do underreported stories from Canada
Yeah.
so that we know Canada's back.
Get JJ.
It's
on.
back, baby. Get JJ on. Good idea. Canada special next week on the TLDR podcast. We'll see you there.
I think.
Over promise,
I don't
under deliver.
Yeah.